All right. Hello, Lian. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Right. As if we just jumped on a call. We haven't been talking very long at all. So, yeah, thank you for agreeing to this because, we've been friends on social media and yeah, rocked up on each other's podcasts a couple of times and what have you. But one thing I've noticed, I love how you show up, how you share. But I also notice that your father often comes up in what you share, in what you're writing. And I get that he played a significant role in who you are today, a significant part, right? As all of our parents do, of course. But I don't think it's not inaccurate to say that I know you had perhaps a non-traditional childhood or upbringing, with him. So, and I thought it would be really cool, and it's kind of a bit selfish because I did reach out to you really I was just genuinely curious, like, what's the whole picture here, right? I wanted to know what's the whole picture about with you and your dad, um, leading up to his premature passing and since, and then what have you seen since, and there's an evolution of a conversation there, and I thought that'd be really cool just to have that conversation with you. So thank you for agreeing to that.
Oh, wow. Thank you for asking. It was very magical, actually. Without going into details, I was just reviewing a practice I have that I do every morning. And I read one of the lines in it, which was, I think it was worded something like receiving masculine, meaning like divine masculine love and provision. It was something like that. And then I finished reading that, and sometimes there's like an obvious like inspiration, like an aligned action to take. And then sometimes, and particularly given that said provision, it comes to me. So I literally read that, and then your message came in. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, wow.
Wow, no, it's beautiful because I don't know what led to me just noticing that, and of course that thought showing up for me, and that again, that desire to have this conversation. Yeah, beautiful. There it is magic, right? The magic
Mm.
of life. I'm sure perhaps we'll come to that a little bit more if we have time. I apologize because I don't know if it's a little bit dark here. It's sunset. Sunset's already occurred here in Bali. Um, just for the context, to set the context of the conversation, because I know you've shared aspects of this elsewhere, but could you just give us like some background, like what was that childhood like? How was it non-traditional, and what was your relationship with your father like?
It's probably quicker to talk about the ways it was traditional because there weren't many. I think the only traditional part was it was a mum and a dad and two children. And we got that bit down. I think in every other way,
Okay.
pretty much it wasn't. Um,
Mm.
yeah, so started kind of like very early years living in Exeter in this big I guess you could call it a mansion house that we shared. It was kind of like a bit like a not quite a commune, but like in that direction, like a group of hippies sharing a house styly. It's so funny because I looked it up on Google Maps a little while ago, and it's now obviously really been kind of like gentrified, and it is this like really like it's amazing street in Exeter, and this like incredibly impressive mansion house. I'm like, yeah, I don't think it was quite like that in those days, um, but anyway, so it was my memories. I mean, we moved from there when I was 3.5, but I've got lots of memories like from a very young age, and so even then, that was probably as normal as my childhood got. But even that, you can see there was it wasn't quite normal. Um, and I had a very I think because particularly my dad, I mean, obviously my mum had a hand in this too, but my dad had an incredibly free spirit and really, I guess, wanted to allow me at that point, my sister was still a baby, to have that sense of real freedom, like autonomy from a very, very young age. So I wasn't feeling contained by his views and his wishes. which I think was in part because his experience had been very different. I'll probably share more about that as we go, but he'd had a very kind of almost like a hot-housed kind of upbringing. And I think as almost like a reaction to that, just thought, I'm not going to do the same when it comes to my children. Probably went maybe too far the other way, but from a very young age, I had this sense of like, I can do anything, which there's one particular memory that came to mind, like even I can fly. There was because it was obviously a tall building, probably maybe 4 stories high, and a fire escape going up the outside. And one day I'd got on top of the fire escape, and then my parents were down below on the ground, and I'm like, I'm going to jump off. Here I go, because I was just absolutely fearless, like so fearless. So it was one of those situations where I could well have done that. And so there was like a kind of talking me down situation. They were down on the ground, like just stay there, Lee, just stay there. And they had to get someone go up on the inside of the house, like come out the door and grab me. So yeah, from a really young age, like freedom was just so present. And then we moved up this way. So obviously both sides of my family actually from Devon. So we were living in Devon, then we moved up to then Essex. I live in Hertfordshire now. And my mum and dad, I think we moved up because my father at that point was a teacher. He'd done a maths and physics degree and then gone into teaching, which is, in one hand, he was a natural teacher. He was like one of life's just natural teachers, but definitely not a natural teacher in a modern school system. So it was like really incongruous kind of fit, really, and didn't work well. And they split up not long after. So I think when I was like 5, they split up, because I think my dad really had that wanderlust, really wanted that just like absolute freedom and adventure. And it just wasn't something, obviously I don't know the ins and outs of their relationship, but if for whatever reason that just, wasn't meant to happen with my mum and dad together. I'm going to stop there, actually. Obviously, I've only kind of talked about the first 5 years and haven't answered either your questions, but I'm just going to pause rather than me just...
Well, I'm curious whether there is anything you could share, and if there isn't, then maybe we'll just edit this bit out. But is there anything you could share that at the time might have really, really surprised and shocked people that you were allowed to do?
It's probably... I probably got clearer memories a bit later. I guess an example is, I can probably give a few actually. One example was I was incredibly inquisitive and just wanted to know everything. And they just took the decision from, I was probably 4 or 5, that my questions would be going on from all sorts of things, but including sex, including procreation. But it's like the depth of my questions wouldn't just stop with a kind of like, yes, there's a man and a woman and they have a nice kiss, and so like I kind of knew everything from a really young age about sex. And I remember I was also my dad taught me to read really young. I was like a fluent reader at 3. And they had that classic book, Everything You Always Want to Know About Sex and Were Afraid to Ask. And I think I did kind of know I shouldn't have been reading it, but I did. Like if I was left alone in the room with the bookcase with that book, I would be sit there. I always remember this, sitting there on the floor next to the bookcase, just like devouring this book. So that's one example, just in terms of like the freedom of I guess acquisition of knowledge. Like there was very few things where it's kind of like that's not appropriate for children. Again, in some ways, I'm not saying that I wouldn't necessarily even advocate that, but that's an example. It's just like if she wants to know, we'll let her find that out. Another example is when, and I'm sure I'll share more about this, when my dad and I were traveling the like scrapes I would get into, because again, it was just like, yeah, if she wants to do it, like let her go do it, she'll find out. And I've got this particular memory where we were on a beach in Ibiza, I think, and the waves were just really, really high, like adult height waves. And my dad was right at the like top of the beach where the kind of road was, having a conversation with someone, and let me at 7 go play in the water with waves this high. And I've just got this like visceral memory of like being taken down under by a wave, like having the whole, I'm dying, I'm drowning. There's like no, like I couldn't tell any, you know, which way was up or anything, like no way of getting to the surface. My dad did come and save me, admittedly. But yeah, it's one of those things like, wow, there's like no way I would let my children even be in the sea without me kind of like being in like very close proximity, but like they wouldn't be anywhere near the water with the waves that size. So yeah, I think that's probably a good example.
Yeah, and I can see that inquisitiveness, you know, is still there, you know, in the conversation we had before we started recording. Like one of the things I love about you is this this openness really to explore further, always open to explore further, but kind of like with nothing on it. Like it is this genuine curiosity. So I think maybe that really is conditioned in you instead of like the traditional childhood upbringing, particularly, you know, I was schooled in, 70s and 80s. It was all about compliance. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of that goes on. I think, you know, fundamentally, traditional education is about compliance. Whereas, what I'm hearing is yours is very much about allowing freedom, allowing inquisitiveness, allowing exploration.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think I've seen that even more so in the last few years about your work. So if we have time, I'll just kind of just touch on that, because I think that, you know, I came across, we met each other, I think around about 2014. We were both, I think, in and around 3 principles, and probably quite into them at that time.
Yes.
And I think we're both right. Okay, so we have that within us, and there's other stuff too, which is, you know, beautiful. But back to your dad. So just a clarity, was he your I'm bringing you up, I presume you still had contact with your mother. What was the situation like in from age 5, you know, onwards until you became a young adult? Were you living with your dad?
So when they first split up, he went to, I think Greece and the Netherlands, I think. And I was just distraught. We'd been so close, and it was just, I kind of went off the rails, really. It's interesting because I have my dad's diaries, and there's he kept diaries like all the way through up until, we think, maybe the last 10 years or so of his life, but we don't know if perhaps he then went electronic. We don't know. It's a kind of gap. But up until then, he kept diaries from, you know, a young age. And there was like various allusions, that sounds weird when I say it out loud, to there being problems with me. But he kind of only ever kind of like gestured. So I don't know. But there was one about me needing to go to a psychologist, which is, you know, like, given how free thinking my dad was, they must have been quite concerned about me to even be, you know, thinking like that. So all I know is I was really struggling with not being with my dad. I just had this really deep sense of like, that's where I need to be. And my mum clearly didn't want me to go. But I think I just made her peace with like, this just isn't working. Like, we can't make this work. She's just going more and more off the rails. And agreed for me to go with my dad. I think just thinking it's going to be temporary, and then of course she's going to like do what is normal in these situations where the girls stay together. Obviously I had a sister, the girls stay together and stay with the mum, like primarily. And it just that, you know, it felt so right. I mean, I think obviously for my dad, there was probably a sense of like, okay, this is not quite how I envisaged this, like, you know, wandering across the globe as this kind of like free man with his 7-year-old daughter in tow. I don't necessarily know that was how he envisaged it, but to his credit, he never gave me that sense. Like, I'm sure there may have been a bit of that initially, but he didn't give me the impression that that wasn't wanted. I think he just thought, okay, well, this is the experience we're having. And it always, you know, there were times, particularly when we were traveling, and then we went back to Devon as well for a time where I did miss my mum, and, you know, could go for like months, potentially, you know, up to a year without seeing her. But it still always felt like this is my place. I'm meant to be with him.
Yeah, incredible. So getting the sense, it's a very close relationship with your father. What was your adult relationship like with him, you know, up to his passing, which we'll come to next, but what was your adult relationship like with him?
Really easy sounds like a not particularly rich word to use, but which I think is a lot of it just testament to who he was. He had just had such a big heart, such a freedom of spirit. You never felt like he was imposing anything on you in terms of how you needed to be, how you needed to show up, the choices you made. Which I'm saying you because I know that would be everyone's experience of him. The fact that I can say that even as his daughter, I never felt like he had this expert. But there's one time I think that I got a sense of like, he's not going to be cool with that. We were talking when I was about 15 about what I was going to do after I left school. And I said, I'm thinking I might train to be a police officer. Which is clearly like totally unsuited to me anyway, but that's, I think I just like the kind of like the idea of being a bit kind of, I don't know, adventurous, and maybe I'd look really glamorous in the uniform. I don't know, whatever reason, or maybe I just said it to like see what he'd say. I'm not quite sure, but whatever reason, that's what I said to him. I've never seen him look so like disgusted, and he was just like, you do that, and yeah. I don't even know what he said. I can't even remember. It was more just like the feeling of like, obviously bearing in mind, he was such a hippie, so free thinking. Like the idea of his daughter being a police officer was just like, what on earth? I've created a monster. But that's literally the only time I felt that sense of like him having an opinion on what I would do, the choices I'd make. And so it was a very easy relationship from that perspective. I could just be whoever I wanted to be. But a very, I guess, deep relationship. He and I were both, again, just very curious about life, thought a lot about life, wanted to make connections between I guess the kind of what you could call the physical and the non-physical, which I found out a lot more about that actually after he died. Like I knew that about him, but it was really only after he died and started to sort of like piece together, I don't know, like clues in his like possessions or in his diaries. Like he'd read pretty much all of the spiritual texts, you know, even the Quran, like, you know, things that just you wouldn't think that someone would do just for the sake of that curiosity, like what's in here, there must be something useful here, something true here. And so we'd have, you know, really weird and wonderful conversations about all sorts of things. He also, you know, same as me, had a real, like a deep connection with the land, with animals. So, you know, a lot of the ways that we would kind of connect would be going out for a walk together, going for a wander, you know, following one of those like Ordnance Survey maps, or these out and about walks or something like that. We'd follow a trail, and like he'd often want to kind of position it around stopping at a pub midpoint. And so yeah, it's very loving but free, easy relationship.
So, gosh, I'm just imagining, and I'm fortunate, I guess, in some respects. My only experience of a close family member passing suddenly was an uncle, and he was like a Peter Pan of our family. He was the guy that I wanted to be. You know,
Mm.
he was so charismatic. He looked so young. He looked 10, 15 years younger than he was, and he died very suddenly. Just fishing on the beach, fell forward, lights out, gone. I just turned 40 a week and a half before that. And yeah, it was like a wake up call through our family. He was 67, looked 55 perhaps. Um, yeah, just the shock of that. So
Mm.
your father passed, I think, 2013, you said, which is kind of
20,
relatively recently, actually.
2012, yeah.
2012, okay,
Mm.
2012. Yeah, still relatively recently, I feel, as an adult anyway.
Mm.
So, oh my goodness, what what was that like for you?
I was pondering this before knowing that we were going to be talking about this. I was pondering this morning, thinking, and I think this does apply more broadly. I was actually thinking of it in relationship to a question that someone asked in the Primal Happiness Facebook group. And I was thinking, it does feel that in those biggest fears that we have is our greatest gold, is the biggest gift. And it's so hard to see that that's going to be so until we see it so. And I was looking back and thinking, that was such a fear of mine. Like, I can feel it's even strange, even being on the other side of it, going back to the feelings I used to have about the idea of my dad dying. There was I had such a fear of it. It's like you can hear it now, like it's so hard for me to when I'm back in that energy, it was like beyond any just like, people die, that's going to be really upsetting. It was like almost a sense of like, I won't be able to go on. Like, that's how I used to hold it. Like, at some point he's clearly going to have to die, but that will be the end of me. Like, I can't even imagine, how would I carry on? Like, and it was such a fear. And I remember my boyfriend I had for about 5 years. I remember his dad had died quite young. I remember one particular holiday we went on, and he must have been talking about it. So it was like in my awareness, like this idea. Not, obviously, I know that dad's died, but must have been just like particularly in my awareness. And thinking like, how has he just carried on though? Like, it just doesn't. It just feels like I can't grok it. Like, how would you carry on? And which I speaking to other people, like, clearly no one has like an easy relationship with the idea of their parents passing, but I think the depths I took that to was probably a bit unusual. Like, it really was like this, like almost like a biggest fear that I had. And then when he died, I won't go massively into the story because I've shared this before, but he was run over. He was run over coming back from the train station. He'd been in London working, come back, was crossing the road. We think he had a push bike, thinking pushing it rather than being on it, and was hit. And we didn't find out until the early hours of the next morning when the police came and knocked at the door, like 5 o'clock in the morning. So it was, real archetypal scenes of, being woken up with that worst news. And I think initially I was just in shock. I remember just feeling a bit spacey, like trying to take all of this information in, like this just feels really odd. And there was like later the same day, my family were all together, obviously, talking about it, trying to process it. And I kept thinking, like, I'm not feeling as I imagined I'd feel. It feels, if anything, I wouldn't necessarily maybe had this languaging then, but it feels like instead of my life's ended, it feels as though like something else has come to life. It was just so tangible. Like that day, it was like there was like, it's a cliche really, but it really did feel like something was waking up. And it was like I was already seeing like, this is so beautiful. This is so beautiful. And I remember I was talking at one point and I was trying to express something around this. And I remember looking at my family, who obviously clearly were like absolutely devastated, shocked, distraught. And I remember having this moment where I was like, their experience isn't my experience. And I probably just need to be a little bit more discerning about what I'm expressing right now, because it's not that it's like not helpful, but there's for people who are just in a completely different space, what I'm saying here isn't really like what they need to hear right now. So yeah, it was right from that very first day, it was just like, wow, my biggest fear isn't anything remotely, nothing at all as I imagined, as I feared. I can speak more about that, but that's like that honestly, like, is such an encapsulation of like what I thought was going to happen. What did happen was just night and day different.
What do you think the gift was? I mean, I'm sure that that sounds like, actually feels like, oh my gosh, it's probably a huge question because there's so much there. But yeah, what comes to mind when you consider that? What was the gift?
There are so many. I'm trying to see if there like a meta gift, or a macro gift. Yeah, there were so many and are so many. I'm trying to. This seems very like self-centered, but it is the thing that comes most to mind. It felt like I got the opportunity to be me, like fully me, which sounds odd given the upbringing I had and the freedom I had. But hey, this modern world like is going to probably get you sooner or later. And looking back, I can see that even with that start in life, and almost in some ways, like especially because of that start in life, like me hitting secondary school was just like not in a pretty way. And I think experiences I had at school and then kind of like jobs, I can see now I'd like, built this shell up around me of like what's going to work, what's going to help me get through this, what's going to help me be approved of. And I think I've probably never seen it quite like this until you've asked that very good question. But it did feel like this kind of like cracking of all of that. And it's just like, none of this was conscious. It wasn't a choice at all. But it feels as though at the deepest level, when I say me, I don't even mean me as a personality. I mean me as like the entirety of me spiritually, which includes like all of us spiritually. But that's what it felt like. It was just like, wow, like here I am. And I get a chance to like experience all of this like fresh and directly.
Yeah, yeah. Like I say, my only experience is with an uncle, but there was a wake up call for that, and I relate to that. Of just like I said, when I say waking up, it's like, oh, this is for real. Like there's no more pretending.
Yeah.
Get on with life, get engaged with life fully. Like there's kind of like there is nothing to lose, and almost like a freedom in that. Well, let's go beyond the death. Let's go beyond that. Like, because I used to be cynical about this, by the way, and then I say life leaves clues. This is funny, actually. Just thought of this. I'll often suggest to clients, it's kind of a little catchy phrase. It'll come up in conversation. Oh, see, life leaves clues, but actually, I think death leaves clues, right? Because I think if we're open, this is how it looks to me. If we're open to it, there absolutely seems to be something beyond that death. And my favorite book on this subject is Anita Moorjani's Dying to Be Me. So have you had, what's been your relationship? It kind of sounds like a strange question, but what's been your relationship with your dad since his passing?
Love that question, Phil. I'm going to refer to a book also, actually, because this definitely was one of those books that I think, firstly, it wasn't a coincidence. I like more and more just see, like a bit like you saying, you know, life leaves clues. This book was one of those clues, and it kind of dropped in that week after my dad died, and it's Journey of Souls. And I can see now that without that, you can't, it's hard to even say like without that, because it was meant to happen that way. But without that, I think the path I would have taken from then on would have been very different. But that book really started to make sense of, I guess, the experiences I was already having. This sense of like, this feels more of like an opening than an ending. It feels like there's more. And I was already starting to have experiences of, it feels as though he's, if anything, more here than he was when he was here in his body. Like the experience I could have of his presence, let's say, was actually often more tangible. It's like he hasn't gone anywhere. This is so strange. Yeah, I can't have him over and make him coffee, but in like the really important way, he's still here. There's one particular time where I was sitting there and I was having a moment. I was feeling quite, because it wasn't like I'm making it could make it sound like my whole experience was just blissful. And there were moments like we were dealing with some really, really difficult realities in that first year in particular, where, just in brief, there were mistakes made by the ambulance service, mistakes made by the police. There was a criminal investigation going on with the driver who had hit him. He had to have 2 post-mortems. We couldn't have the funeral for 5 weeks. It just rumbled on and on and on. And so there were some really kind of, you know, real life, very, very difficult situations to deal with. I chose to take the lead in terms of, you know, being the person who would deal with the police and all the rest of it. So there were some really, you know, dark moments too. You know, there was this experience of bliss and some really dark moments. And I had one of those moments where I was feeling, you know, quite just, oh, this is really taking me down at the moment. And I felt like his presence like come over me like a hug, like it was just like he'd come, and like he used to give the best. I feel emotional. I used to give the best bit of hugs, like proper full-bodied, like come here, like I've got you kind of hugs. And I felt his energy just like come and just give me this massive hug. And when I hear people talk about things like that, you know, like people might talk about experiences with a spirit, and I think it's really hard to, like, you want to believe it, you want to think like, oh my god, what an amazing experience, that proves it is true. And it's only really when you have like one of those own, like for me personally, like it's only when I have those experiences, like I know, like, okay, there's no way I could have just conjured that up. It was real, it happened. And then, so that book, Journey of Souls, really started to join the dots and explain things that I was already experiencing. It wasn't like I read the book and was like, okay, now I know that that's like, I'm kind of just going to believe that. It was just more making sense of things I was already starting to experience. And the book is written by a hypnotist, hypnotherapist, who had almost, I think, initially accidentally taken someone, not just of the past lives, but that lives between lives. That's what his work was about. Like, and he took loads and loads of people, like hundreds, if not thousands of people, into this place of like lives between lives, like what you could call the spirit world. And the similarities between how they describe those experiences were just like, whoa. And just having that understanding of there is something more than this, you know, material world that we can see, just felt like, well, I don't know if it's exactly as they're describing, it probably doesn't matter, but that is a way that I can kind of hold it that like just seems to like rest easily for me. So going back to what you said about my relationship with my dad, that was probably the starting point of recognizing like, oh, there is still a relationship to be had here. Like, if anything, it could even be a deeper relationship, a more magical relationship, a more powerful relationship. It just isn't the relationship it was.
Yeah. And I'm wondering about do you think your relationship with your own mortality has changed or even your view of that had changed?
Oh gosh, yes, completely. Really. And I think I mentioned to you before that I lost my mum too 4 years later, I think. So fairly recently, 2016. And like, she didn't pass in the same way as my father, obviously, but it was equally sudden. And I think having both parents die like that, and I was thinking back about this morning as well. My first experiences of death were, I guess, not necessarily like normal either, in that I hadn't experienced any much in the way of kind of like, like grandparents and things like that dying, up until I was in my teens, and then experienced both my uncle dying in his 20s suddenly, like really fit. He was a PE teacher, really fit and active, and had what we think was an underlying heart problem no one knew about, and literally just collapsed on the football field in his 20s. And then a really close family friend who'd actually lived with us for a time, amazing man, I was so close to him, and he committed suicide, and he was in his 20s too, like early 20s actually, I think. And so I think I'd had quite my relationship with death, because probably of those two things happening, like, which seems so tragic, so hard to make sense of, so brutal, like it's ended, that's it. And so I don't think I'd had a particularly like healthy, let's say, or open relationship with death, or like including my own, until my dad died. And then, yes, absolutely, as you've described, there was like this total shift in my experience of my own mortality, and just, the idea of death as a whole. And I think that was compounded when my mum died, both in terms of realizing, like, yeah, we really don't know when it's going to happen. Like we think we plan our retirements and all this, like we get these, like, because as humans we love the control, and so we do what we can to, like, he's not saying none of that makes sense, like not saying like don't go plan your retirement, but we can get really bought into this idea of like, because I'm planning it, it's going to happen, like it's a guarantee, I'm going to be here until I'm 80, 90, 100, whatever it might be. And I think with both of them dying like that, there was definitely this sense of like, oh yeah, it really could happen to any one of us, including myself, like that. And that's okay. That's okay, actually. Like, I am okay with that. And so that's just, it's a cliche, but definitely made me much more aware and like pay attention more. Like, there is definitely like a kind of like underlying gratitude and appreciation, but I think it's more than that. Like, makes me just pay attention to life more, to the things that we think are important. It's like, well, maybe it's all in the, like, the small stuff, the small details, the small gestures and conversations. So that's really changed, which is, I suppose, more is to change my relationship to life more than it has death. But yeah, I don't really have it doesn't scare me. It doesn't scare me. It really very much does feel like it's and again, I think particularly my work over the last few years, really getting into that deep communion with the cycles of this world, and like, yeah, we can't have life without death, like, it's the more we're able to be in like deep communion with that death, like life, death, rebirth cycle in all of its forms, including actual death, the more like in the experience we are, like the more that we're able to have the experience that I believe we chose to come here for.
Yeah, and I resonate and relate to so much of what you've said. Certainly, and I don't know if dark humor is okay, but I will just say, like, it would make one hell of an episode if I go whilst you're on this recording. I still want you to put this out, okay? Right, is that okay?
So, likewise, if I go, you and Jonathan like arrange that together.
Okay, goodness gracious.
That'd be so cool.
God, what an episode. Wow. Um, I was going to ask, yeah. So I'm going to ask, what role is what you've seen now in your work? Because as I've touched on, I see, it looks to me like you are much more expressive and you are playing much more with the magic side of life and spirit. So how has that come about for you?
It's really interesting because my dad completely had a hand in that. Yeah, I love that you've asked me this. So this is one of those questions where there's like so much I could say, and I'm just trying to like, how much can we fit into the space we've got? So I'll start by saying my dad was someone who you would describe as magical. You know, most people that knew him would probably use the word magic in relationship to him. And that would be just in his being, just like that, you know, like free possibility, playful, you know, like he just really just had that in his being. But it was also expressed in tangible ways too. I've shared before that I learned my left and right, which wasn't easy for me. I have dyspraxia, and I really struggle with like binary things and kind of like processing things. And I learned my left and right from two floor to ceiling tarot cards he'd painted on our sitting room wall, one of the high priestess and one of the magician. And
Wow.
so as a kind of really tangible example of, you know, that wasn't a kind of, you know, big statement for him. That was just him. Like if you knew him, that would be a completely normal thing for him to do, is to paint a ceiling like tarot cards on his wall.
Of course. Yeah.
Who doesn't? And so there was just, that was very like normal for me growing up. And it was a real, I don't think there's necessarily like a one day conscious decision, but over time there was a closing in me to those ideas, where it was not like we had to have these kind of like, and the interesting thing was my dad was very scientific. Like I said, he did maths and physics at university, you know, like he had no struggle. He was actually like genius in terms of intellect. He, you know, I mentioned earlier, he was hothoused. He had a genius level IQ, and like immense validated. And so from quite a young age was really seen as his kind of great white hope. And, you know, like we need to make sure he's like, you know, really focused and, you know, it's doing his studies and all the rest of it. And which then he obviously really rebelled against. So I think I've not necessarily inherited like that degree of intellect, but I've definitely inherited that kind of like, I love to understand the logic of things. I'm always looking for the first principles. Like that matters to me. That isn't something that I probably, you know, no matter how far I go into magic, like I always still want to know, like, how does this work? What's the underlying structure of this? And he seemed to be able to dance much more easily and gracefully between those two worlds than I did for much of my adult life. So there was a definite, like, I kind of like went, okay, it's all about the logic, it's all about the evidence, it's all about the science, and just like lost the magic for many years, even though one way or another it kept trying to knock on my door. It like, so I've had so many experiences where it was trying to like make its way back into my life, and I was just like a hard no to it. And over the last 2 or 3 years, so quite recently really, you know, I'd still been a hard no, despite everything that I've just described, despite this like opening up to what you could call the spiritual, I still had a kind of like a block when it had come to certain things. It's like, oh, I can be with oneness and I can be with like the material plane, nothing in between. And it really has been, again, quite recent, last 2 or 3 years, that it had got to the point where those nudges were just growing, you know, more and more hard. They're harder and harder to ignore. And so I've kind of like been dipping my toe like in to the world of magic, and then back out again, and then in and then back out again. And then last year, a series of events happened where the signs and messages were just growing louder and louder and louder. I was just like, oh, okay, I'm gonna just like agree to walk this path, come what may. It still terrifies me. I still don't even know if I believe in it, but hey, I'm going to, open up and see what's there to be seen. And the one particular really, I think this probably was the point where I just like, okay, I'm doing it. I'd been reading my dad's diaries, and I hadn't read them. I'd like, when he died, we had got, all his diaries. My sister read them immediately. And I hadn't. I'd flicked through a few and just didn't feel like I wanted to. Not really there wasn't a kind of sense of like, I'll be upset or anything like it. Just, I didn't feel the draw to. And then this year I suddenly did. And he was ridiculous, honestly, sickeningly talented. Like, you name it, he was great at it. He was also, despite everything I've also said, he was also a really talented musician, singer, songwriter. And so throughout his diaries, he'd often write songs or poems as well. And there was this particular quite weird poem or song that he'd written about his girlfriend at the time, my sister and I. Maybe my mum as well. My mum and he stayed. Him and my mum stayed really, really close, like best friends, right up until he died. And so I think it may have been about her as well. And so he'd written a verse about each of them, and then ended with a verse about me, which was so weird. Like the others kind of like made sense. Mine was just like really trippy and out there, quite dark in places, and then ended with something that said something like, "See it, Lee, see it all, it's all true."
Wow.
And it was one of those ones like, is there a way I could make this mean something than it sounds like it means?
Incredible.
Yeah. And it was just like, okay, I'm going to trust you on this. It still doesn't make logical sense to me how it all can be true, but I'll see. So yeah, it's so clear he had his hand in that. And that was something he'd written, I don't know, 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes perfect sense. What I see that you're up to now makes even more sense now. It just makes perfect sense, given, what I see about you, what you've shared. It makes perfect sense. We've had a couple of questions. You all right still for a few more minutes? Should we touch on a couple of these questions? So I'm really sorry if I'm mispronouncing this name. I always think it's Sarah if there's no H, and Sarah if there is.
Yes, it is. Yep.
Right, great. So Sarah asks, right, so if time is not linear, then why do we only really hear about past lives and not about future lives, right? And there's another subsequent question, like when people feel close to a loved one that's passed, what is it that's being felt? And when we're receiving messages from a loved one, who or what is it that we're receiving their messages from? And I've got a view on this, which I'm happy to share. I had a past life regression session relatively recently, in the past few weeks, and it felt like, yes, I had gone back to a past life, but there's a part of me that acknowledges, well, I could just be completely making that up. I could just be completely imagining that. But there was also a moment where I felt all of time and space, all of future, all of past, just at the same. Well, it wasn't even a moment, but it's just at the same, and in a kind of white light as well. Just a moment of that, the beauty that actually brought me to tears, almost like sunlight. I mean, I read a bit about NDEs and what have you, and it seems to be in alignment with that. I'm not claiming that it is that at all. So all I had was that experience, which I can describe in that way, and it seems to me that that really well-worn analogy of, we're all part of the ocean and we're a wave that express and return to the ocean. So to me, it feels like we are, when we're in touch with somebody who has passed on, we are in touch with the aspect of their spirit that exists, just as like that wave still exists in the totality of the ocean, but it is now and always has always been part of the ocean. And it might not be so obvious that there is that separate entity, if you like, but it is still there. So yeah, how does that look to you?
Yeah, I love the analogies you use, because I use one that's like almost the same. And it's a twist on the Rumi quote of we're not an ocean in the drop, we're a drop in the ocean. And far be it from me to say like I know better than Rumi, but but I'm gonna. For me, it's like it's actually more like, it's not more paradoxical, magical than that. Like, it's both. We are both. We are the ocean in a drop. And so there is a kind of dropness to us, and we are the whole ocean. And that for me, like, yeah, it is a metaphor, but for me, it's the closest one I can get to like being able to kind of be in that like sense of like, how could it be both? That makes sense to me as a way of, again, my own limited human mind being able to make sense of that, which I think very much is how you've just expressed it, is very much how I do. And so yeah, just as you've said, that drop is present whether someone is in a human form or not. And so of course we're still going to feel their presence if that is something we're open to, if it's aligned for us to be able to receive that. I mean, that's what I just see over and over now. You could really apply this to anything, but we receive what we're available to receive. I know sometimes like, well, if that's true, why wouldn't I have experienced, the presence of my loved one when passing, like just for that moment or for that period of time? Who knows? If we're not available to receive that energetically, it could just blow our systems apart to have that kind of experience. Therefore, the universe is quite kind. It's not going to give us an experience we're not able to be with. So, going back to the past lives, future lives question, which I love, it seems to me, again, it comes back to us being only able to actually have that experience that we can hold. Like, our human minds are brilliant, but like, honestly, compared to like what's really available, like our consciousness is tiny, and it's just like, it would blow our freaking minds if we could really hold all of existence, all of life, all of the universe, all of consciousness, all of the time. And I think we get those moments of wonder where we just get an experience like you described, where suddenly we're like, I can see it all. But to be able to live from that place and have any degree of like human experience, where we've got children and, jobs and stuff, be impossible. And so I really do see that there's like, it seems, yes, that time isn't linear and it's kind of all happening as happened, and yet through our human understanding we're not going to have access to that because it would just blow our freaking minds. And going back to that kind of drop ocean thing again, I had past life regression in that year after my dad died, via a hypnotherapist that had studied in the same lineage as the chap who's wrote that book I mentioned, Journey of Souls. And I had two lives that I got to experience, and like you're saying, like, did I even make it up? I don't know. I can only share what I experienced in that moment. One was me as a small boy in Ireland, and I had this experience where in that lifetime I was a healer, and there was a soldier that came over, and there was just real deep experience of just like absolute love, like overwhelming, like unconditional love for this soldier, in the experience of like, I was there to heal him. I think he was actually like wasn't a friendly soldier, as it were, but that was the experience I was shown, like me with this just heart wide open, there to heal this soldier. And then the other experience, I was a man in this one. It may even been the same life, but I was an adult man and I was a priest. And the interesting thing is, in the one where I was the boy, my mum in that life was my daughter now. And she didn't look anything like her. I just knew. It was just the experience of her, like spirit, her underlying energy. It was my daughter. And so again, who knows, you know, our minds make weird connections that aren't always there. I can only share that that was my experience of her. And so, yeah, it seems to me like there is, you know, all of this is like coming together quite neatly. There's that kind of like, we can only experience what's available to us. And I think for us to experience these future lives would just be a lot for us to handle. Like, we're not meant to see the future in these limited human lives. And those drops often do in Journey of Souls, we're kind of described as being kind of part of a soul group or soul family. And we will kind of have those drops, as it were, kind of follow us through in different human relationships, which, you know, to me sounds delightful. Was there anything else I wanted to say about that? I think that's probably everything that makes. Oh, just very briefly, I was in a hypnotic trance literally in the last week or so, and I had what seemed to me a glimpse of a future life. It's the first time it's happened, so it's like, it's strange timing that I've just been asked that, but I had this just glimpse of me in what just looked completely like a future life. I still felt like me, and had this just glimpse of like, this is the future. Whoa. And it was very fleeting, but there was just this sense of like, wow. And not this me either, like a much more future me.
Okay, bearing in mind the time, I think we'll whiz through, was there maybe 3 more questions here, but I think we'll just whiz through these. But I'm sure maybe you can comment on these perhaps in your Facebook group or whatever. But Tess has asked really about ghosts. Not really a question here, just an expression of like recognizing a fear of ghosts actually, and how irrational that can be. I'm wondering if that's kind of covering up some kind of gift there as well. And like I can totally get the fear there, and actually even as children, we're kind of like, ghosts are demonstrated as something to fear, you know, and to me, I recognize that fear there is generally in the unknown. But what's your view of that?
I love that question. It was actually what had me, you know, I mentioned earlier, it was a question in the group that had me realizing like that, like, oh, this has showed up with my dad's death. That greatest fear turned out to be such a gift. And it was Tess's question that had me pondering that. And I've always had that same fear that Tess has had, you know, around ghosts. And it very much does look to me from my experiences over the last year. As you've said, I think those of us who have come here with some kind of like the reason we're here does involve having some kind of openness to like non-physical beings, let's say. Of course, that is as scary as hell, you know, completely outside of our, especially our domesticated human experience and kind of what's okay. And so it makes complete sense. Like the thing that we're talking about, this like, you know, taboo thing of like ghosts, you know, non-physical beings are scary and dangerous and like completely not okay. It makes sense that those of us that potentially are here to have experiences with non-physical beings would also have that in shadow and experience the kind of like the less nice end of that, as let's say. So that's definitely been my experience. And I wonder, you know, and again, it has to be when we're ready for it. Going back to what I've said, you know, we can only energetically receive what we're going to be able to, like, our systems are going to be able to handle. I'm not saying, you know, go straight and like, you know, do a like, you know, Ouija board or something, but, you know, find ways that are gentle and right for us to start to open to those parts of us that have been held there with this, like, you know, again, such a level of fear that we haven't possibly been able to even open the box, you know, just gently, and be supported in it as well. You know, I have, as I've walked this path, I've really made sure I've got good support in place in various forms. Like, for example, this year I'm doing my shamanic training with a really good experienced shaman with assistance. So it's not like I'm just like, you know, rushing headlong into like, you know, I'm wide open now, you know, spirit world, come get me, you know, like you know, get the guidance you need. That's what I would say.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Pablo asks, and I love this question. I can give a very brief answer to this. What is the ego's role in death, if any at all? Psychedelics hint to the shredding of ego prior to death. If so, is there a more limited role for the ego while alive? And what does that practice look like? So to me, again, this is just how it looks to me. That's all I've got. That's just how it looks to me. The ego is really the part of our thinking, the part of our being that we can call it an illusion or whatever. But anyway, that is the belief under the illusion that we are an individual, separate entity. So, and it just looks to me from, books and my own experiences and what have you, that is no longer necessary once we're passed back to source. When we go, if you like, the wave returns to the ocean and is back to the ocean, even though from this side it looks like we are communicating with the individual entity. And I think that's just how it works, so that we recognize, we could call that ocean spirit, God, or whatever, and that looks to me like that is who we're communicating with. So to me, it's like, yes, the ego doesn't exist at all on the other side. And the second part of this question, is there a more limited role for the ego while alive? I used to be all about this, can we transcend that? Whereas now I'm very much about, let's embrace it. Like, I flipping love my ego. It's like, let's bring love into the role of the ego in life. How about you?
Yeah, I love what you said there, Phil. I feel similarly, actually. I can so see how, and it's like everything, there's often real wisdom and benefit in these beliefs, and then there's also often shadow there too. And there can be in spiritual communities that we've both been in, this desire to transcend the ego, however we're talking about. We might just be calling it thought or thinking, but ultimately that kind of that's the thing that we don't really need. Let's transcend it, and then we can be these beautiful spiritual beings floating about. And over the last few years, and then even more so as I've started to consciously walk the path of magic, it looks really different to me. I love the way that Bill Plotkin talks about it in his work. And I think he really distills this beautifully in his book Soulcraft, where he doesn't talk about it as like the ego is something that we kind of don't really need, and the idea is to just transcend it. He has this wonderful model that I often refer to. I've kind of Jonathan and I've taken it, and that kind of, we've got our own philosophy, but it definitely does borrow from this idea that Bill developed, which is we've got this idea of ascension, transcending the ego and having that experience of us as non-separation, oneness, non-duality, what we're going to call it. We can descend, which is into the body, into the soul, into that kind of unique essence that we came here to be. But there's this ego in the middle. And this isn't about let's try and get that out. It's about how can we mature it. So it's actually, of service, of use, a true adult, in a sense, like most of us don't really know in this domesticated culture. Like in indigenous cultures, had a really clear understanding of what it took for someone to be an adult. That's what he's talking about, a mature ego. And I love that. That feels so much richer to me, so much more whole. It's like, why would we discard something? It's actually so useful in us being able to have this experience here. Yes. So that there's that I just for me makes so much sense. And then the other part of it is through this lens of magic. In magical terms, it can be described as true will, which I might describe as soul, that kind of that drop, that essence that we came here to have an experience in this particular lifetime as. And then there's the personal will, which you could describe as the ego, that is here to almost carry that out. It has to be something that kind of carries it out here. And I think we all have that experience of like when we're really in a flow, in alignment. And for me, that's that when you've managed to get like both parts, like, operating as something that has, some really beautiful synchronicity or flow between them, where the ego is actually something that's like, you're seen as a gift, like, yes, that is
Yes.
how
Yes.
I'm going to manifest divine will,
Mhm.
true will, my
Mhm.
soul. It's here as a
Yeah.
gift to be used, to be embraced, like celebrated even. So that's where I am now. It's like certainly not like ego is the enemy, let's try and like shred it to bits to get rid of it. It's just like, no, like, like that's the yummy part.
Beautiful, Lian. Thank you so much. Okay, so one more question from your group, and then I've got a closing question for you. I'm really conscious we've overran a little bit, but
So it wasn't a small topic though, was it?
yeah, it was never going to be a small topic. I say so. Celeste says, this is very relevant for me. My grandfather just passed. We've been exploring different reactions to death, duality of death, suspending judgment, and leaving space for multiple parallel narratives and experiences. Gosh, yeah. I'd love to hear yours and his insights on our capacity to create space, trust, and connection around death, especially when this individual was divisive in life. And I think this is such a beautiful question. I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I'm just going to suggest that, as cliche as it sounds, to me, love is the answer to this inquiry. Okay, but yeah, what do you think, Lian?
It's firstly, I really feel the heart in that question, and I think a lot of people have an experience when a family member dies, that the ripples are felt throughout the family in all kinds of ways that we can't imagine. That it can cause. We had a real rift in our family happen in the events after my dad died. And it will bring, and it's not just death that does this, but I think death is one of those portals that just like opens up. And COVID and everything that's happened as a result is another example of this. These ruptures where we just get to experience more of ourselves, including shadow, including fear. And so that's what's happening, if it's happened to a family, like communally, we've got this kind of rupture, and then we're just all getting like all of this out and on display, which is a lot to be with, whilst we're already going through our own, experiences of the grief and the loss. And so firstly, I completely agree with you, Phil. Like if anything is a call for love, is times like that. And that again is personally and collectively. And then and this takes, again, going back to that sort of ego maturity we're talking about, this takes a kind of like sovereign choosing into, but these times can be the greatest gift if we're willing to say like, oh yeah, this is the material for my liberation. This person that's showing up, right now as being whatever it might be, greedy or whatever it might be, like what could this be for me as material for my liberation? What am I, how can I be in relationship to this in a way that allows me to kind of move through judgment, not put it to one side, not make it wrong, but like really allow myself to choose into this experience and see what that is going to allow me to expand into. Because that's what it just, I love that we've ended up here actually, because if there is a kind of like, for me, a point to any of this, it is how can we like choose into like that fullest experience was got to include learning, and we can have that choice, like this is for me. And I would even go, I love Michael Beckwith's way of describing the four kingdoms of consciousness, and the fourth is this: life is happening as me. And I love that, that's sometimes seems really out of reach to even be able to see that, but even as an invitation, even as an inquiry, if this was life happening as me, if this uncle being right now like a really like bitter, nasty, greedy jerk, if this is life happening as me, like why is it happening like that? what's there for me? Like, why am I creating life like this? And what could I take from this? Like, how can I harness this in service of me expanding into more of me?
Beautiful. Thank you, Lian. Thank you. So my final question might appear like probably an impossible question to answer, and I've been thinking, so I want to just phrase it carefully, because I think you could come up with a million answers to this if I asked you, like, what's the one? But
What are my
what's
favorite things
one?
about you, Phil?
Not. Brilliant. Yeah. Well, then we definitely would run over with time, wouldn't we? Okay. Anyway, so I mean, what is one thing about your dad, or one lesson actually from your dad, that you would like your children to really embody?
Oh. It feels as though what comes to mind doesn't answer your question, but I'm going to trust somehow it will. And there might be tears. I wrote and read a eulogy for him at his funeral. And I'm just going to tell you this little story first as well, actually, because it's I just want to create a kind of image for you to be able to see as part of this. I had such a strong sense that I wanted to be one of the coffin bearers, and which is obviously pretty atypical for a woman, but it just felt like, you know, our relationship, I couldn't not do it. I had to do that. And firstly, my God, I don't know if you've ever carried a coffin. They are really heavy. I didn't imagine that. Totally didn't dress for it. So there was like me and some family members, and I think probably a few of the kind of like formal funeral directory type people, all dressed in suits, and I was wearing this kind of like slinky little lace dress, red high heels, carrying the coffin. So that's totally irrelevant to the question you asked me, but I just wanted to share that with you, just so you can set the scene. Anyway, so I wrote this eulogy for him, and the word that just kept coming to me as I was writing about him was legacy. And he was a very, like, despite the fact he was so incredible in so many ways, he was quite humble, really. He wasn't like, you know, he certainly wasn't this kind of like, look at me, I'm amazing kind of person at all. And probably would never even use the word legacy about himself. You know, he wasn't one of those people that had this just like, you know, I must leave a legacy. And in some ways you could say, given how talented he was, how amazing he was, it's like, is he a good example of someone that's left a legacy? But it's just like that word was just so clear to me, like there is something about him and what he's left as a legacy. And it really was clear. It was the effect he had on people. Like his funeral was just packed to overflowing. Like we couldn't fit everyone in quite a big crematorium. And like he had such an impact on people. He had such, again, like, you know, such a big heart, such a enormity of spirit. And, you know, clearly I can say this, you know, the effect he had on me, the legacy left me as his daughter was probably even more profound. But, you know, you could have asked anyone there and they would have said similar things about him. And that was so clear to me. It was like legacy he left in terms of the relationships and what he brought to people, brought to their lives and made possible for them, like what he opened up in them was his legacy. And that really is like, as you asked me that question, like that came to mind. I'm thinking that seems like an odd thing, you know, in terms of that thing he left me with that I want to pass to my children. But I think that really is, again, going back to like why we're here. It's about, you know, those moments, those experiences, the relationships we make, like who we're creating as a result of us showing up as who we came here to be. Yeah, so I think, you know, it feels like I'm turning into you, Phil, here, but, you know, it really is like, if there's one thing that I take from my dad that I want my children to kind of like have passed down into them, it's like that legacy of love.
Beautiful, a beautiful place to end bring our conversation to a close. Thank you so much, Lian. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with you. I'll be wanting to listen to it back. Yeah, really beautiful. Thank you so much.
Oh, Phil, honestly, I'm struggling to even find the words to express my gratitude. This has been, yes, such a gift in ways I wasn't expecting. I've like lost the words completely now. But yeah, so beautiful. Thank you so much.